Okay, we do. So Secretary Rice and Ambassador McFaul, welcome to Montana virtually.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Seth Bodnar. I'm the president here at the University of Montana, and we are so happy to have you both here. You probably can't see everything. I think you can see Denise May, our wonderful sign language interpreter. I'm not sure the view that you can see, but to give you context, you are live streaming here to the University Center Theater at the University of Montana with a room packed full of engaged members of our wonderful community who are so excited to have you here with us today. And so we're going to get started here. And in fact, I've asked one of our amazing students here at the University of Montana, Beatrix Frizzell, to kick off today's event with an introduction. So Beatrix.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Founded by an act of Congress in 1983, the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center is the preeminent research and community outreach center in Montana dedicated to a nonpartisan approach to ethics in public affairs and international engagement in honor of the legacy of Senator Mike Mansfield. Mansfield was our country's longest serving Senate Majority Leader, as well as the longest serving US Ambassador to Japan under both Presidents Carter and Reagan. In 1999, veteran Washington Post journalist David Broder referred to Mansfield as, quote, "the man who may be the greatest living American," end quote. That description fits the modest statesman who rose from poverty to international acclaim, while continuing to faithfully serve the citizens of Montana and the nation. We are honored to invite you today to the annual Mansfield Lecture, our annual signature event since Mike Mansfield's time. My name is Beatrix Frizzell, and I'm a junior here at the University of Montana studying political science and environmental science and sustainability. I'm a presidential leadership scholar through the Davidson Honors College and a 2022 Truman Scholar. I am honored to introduce and welcome today's speakers, Secretary Rice and Ambassador McFaul. Full bios for our speakers are available with the Zoom registration. With that, I will turn it over to University of Montana President Bodnar as our moderator for today's discussion.
All right, thank you, Beatrix. And as I shared with our studio audience, I think as we'll call it, before the Zoom came live, Beatrix is a wonderful young person who is not just an accomplished scholar. She's studying political science and environmental science and sustainability. She is the co-captain of our cross-country team. And we're so proud to celebrate her award or her honor of receiving a Truman Scholarship this past week. She is gives us hope in the future of this democracy. So we are short on time in that we only have an hour with these two incredible leaders. So we're going to break it up in chunks. I'm going to start by asking a few questions, and then we have some audience members who are going to ask questions to live here in person and to via Zoom. So we're working to master the hybrid meeting here, and then we're actually going to open it up to questions from our live studio audience for the last few minutes, depending on time available. So again, I want to thank you both for being here. It's such an honor. I know, obviously, Ambassador McFaul, having grown up here, you know Montana well, and we're so grateful for your work with the Mansfield Center. And Secretary Rice, I know you've made multiple trips to Montana yourselves and have some close friends here. And we love having you here virtually and would love to welcome you here to Missoula at some point in the future. But when we first discussed this event, for those who aren't aware, we wanted to focus really on this joint interest of the Mansfield Center and the Hoover institutions in terms of understanding the current challenges to our democracy. Obviously, in the intervening period, we've seen the dark and horrific cloud of war move over Ukraine, and I want to acknowledge that we have two of the world's leading experts on Russia with us, and we're going to get to that topic. But I do want to honor the really important discussion that was the premise of this lecture originally, which really was the basic issues of our democracy. And I want to start there for a few minutes. and really start broad, because I think there are plenty of reasons to be concerned about the state of democracy, both internationally and here at home. And I just want to ask, each of our guests today, maybe start with a, analysis of the current state, of our country's democracy. Maybe start with Secretary Rice and then go to Ambassador McFaul.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to spend the time with you and with my great friend and colleague, Mike McFaul. I indeed do spend some time in Montana and for music camp from time to time. And so it's a beautiful state, and I hope to visit the university in the future. Well, I think we can start by saying that the United States of America is very fortunate in the institutions that we have. The remarkable institutions that were given to us by founding fathers 240 years ago that are still viable, that still are a means for peaceful change in our country. I would just note that I grew up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama, and later on took an oath of office to the Constitution of the United States of America that once counted my ancestors as 3/5 of a man. So our Constitution is capable of channeling peaceful change. But it is also true that American institutions are facing some real challenges. First and foremost, I think, is the challenge of a lack of confidence in those institutions by Americans themselves. Poll after poll after poll shows that Americans trust less their electoral process. They trust less the institutions of Congress or the presidency. They don't trust the media. And so no great democracy can flourish if there's a lack of trust in institutions. And I think we need to start to get to the bottom of what's causing that lack of trust. I think our institutions are buffeted by technological change. It's doubtful that the founding fathers would have foreseen the kind of rapidity of information, some of it true, some of it not true, that causes it causes it to be difficult to tell what is really accurate and what is not, given the nature of the way that we get our information. And then most importantly, I think we've come to not trust each other very much. And that sense of polarization, that we can't sit and have a civil conversation if we disagree about an issue, that we rush instead to the ramparts to claim that good is on our side rather than listening to the other side. I think those are some of the challenges to American institutions. But I just want to go back to the first point, which is that they are still strong, they are still capable. But to quote a longtime friend and colleague of Mike's and mine, George Shultz, democracy is not a spectator sport. And so the state of those institutions will ultimately depend on us.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ambassador McFaul.
Well, thank you. First, I want to thank Condi for being here. I tried to get her to give this lecture and she said, Mike, I'll do it if you join me. So that's why we're both here together. And second, it's great to be back virtually at the University of Montana. I was there, Seth, you hosted me when my last book came out. Fantastic event. I don't remember where it was, but it was downtown in a theater. And what I loved about it is you were serving alcohol, and that made it a very festive book talk. So I look forward to coming back when my next book is out that I'm finishing up right now. Just let me say something broad, and then I'm sure we'll dig into some of the specifics. I too am an optimist about the American democratic system, like Condi. I was debating on a podcast the other day about Russia with a friend of mine who was born in Moscow. And I sounded slightly more optimistic about the future of democracy in Ukraine than she did. And at one point in the podcast, she said, Mike, I've known you for a long time. The basic difference between the two of us, why you're so optimistic and I'm pessimistic, is that I was born in Moscow and you were born in Montana. So I don't think it's just that, but I do think the institutions are resilient. They do give us the power of renewal in a way that no other democratic system, no other system in the world does, right? As Churchill said, democracy is horrible, except for all of the other systems. And I remain cautiously optimistic that we'll do that again. Number two, both anecdotally and reading some of our colleagues, I would strongly recommend, by the way, everything that Mo Fiorina from the Hoover Institution writes about these issues. Mo's basic bottom line of the argument, I'm paraphrasing, is that most Americans are purple. We're not red and blue. It's the institutions and the elites and media that push us into those extremes. Let me just say, when I think of Montana, I just looked it up. You may be surprised that the first time that President Obama ran for president, he won 47% of the vote in Montana. John McCain only got 49. That wasn't 150 years ago, folks. That was just a few years ago. And remember, this is Montana we're talking about. We're supposed to be the reddest state in the world, in the country, and yet Barack Obama got 47% of the vote. That I can't believe that preferences and opinions have changed so rapidly in Montana between that vote and now. What it suggests to me is that the institutions, to underscore what Condi said, has shaped us and pushed us in these ways, including the way we nominate presidential candidates, including our media, including the way we finance things. And then just anecdotally, I would say, I don't know if people remember, but my high school debate partner in Bozeman Senior High was a guy named Steve Daines. I don't know if you know him. Steve and I have some pretty radical different views on domestic politics, but we talk. We share opinions. Our families know each other. And by the way, I'm very happy that Steve went to Kiev the other day. Senator Daines went to Kiev, and what I find, Seth, that if you're on TV or you're on Twitter, God forbid, and you're not interacting directly with people, it's really easy to think of them as being evil and stupid and reactionary or radical, communist, fascist. But when you talk to people and you actually interact with them, it's a lot harder to do that. And I think, anecdotally, that is true every time I do it. I say this as a Democrat at the Hoover Institution, by the way. And I just think modalities of doing that on the micro level can help us get to the macro level that we want, which I think is where most Americans are: purple, not red and blue.
Well, thank you both. I I respect and am grateful for your optimism. I think you can't be a leader if you're not optimistic, and I appreciate not you're not ungrounded optimism as well. You alluded to it, Ambassador McFaul and Secretary Rice. You've spoken and you're certainly doing some work around the urban rural divide in this country. And we obviously are in a state where we are in a metropolitan center of Montana with the 75,000 or so person city of Missoula, which is a big urban area for our state. But I'd like you to maybe speak a little bit about this concept of the urban rural divide. The state of it, does it continue to grow? And I'm informed by a question Melinda from Trout Creek submitted prior to this. And she asks, what can citizens of rural areas do to bridge that increasing polarization? So maybe start, Secretary Rice.
Yes, well, I was born in a state that had a similar divide. Alabama is a state also partly very rural, partly very urban. And I think every state actually has that divide. I would just, California is thought of as Los Angeles and San Francisco and San Diego, but Mike can tell you that if you go out into some of the agricultural areas of California, you would also feel that divide. Part of the problem is that we don't have many means any longer to talk across urban rural divides, across divides of class, across divides in our country of people who hold one set of views and others who don't. I think that we need more ways to get to know each other. I was really struck after the 2016 election that some of my colleagues started saying things like, I think I want to go to Alabama and find out what those people think. And I would think to myself, if you have to do an archaeological dig on your fellow citizens, we've lost something. And I do think we've lost something. We don't do military service together any longer. We increasingly We might not go to the same universities together any longer. And so I've become a real proponent of those opportunities that help us cross divides. Teach for America. The questioner asked, what can rural people go and teach in a city, and have people from the cities go and teach in rural areas? I'm actually a proponent of national service. Voluntary, to be sure, because I don't want to conscript anybody into national service. But I would love to see that there's a year, a gap year. We've all been talking a lot about gap years over the last couple of years. How about a gap year in which you go to some place quite unlike where you lived or where you grew up, and you actually in contact with people who are different? So I think we have to actively try to deal with these divides. We can't just talk about them. We can't wish them away. We're going to have to find ways that we actually meet people who come from fundamentally different parts of the country than we do. And if we don't, we have a tendency, to Mike's point, we have a tendency to caricature them. Rural people do this, or rural people like this, or people in urban centers on the coast like this, or they do that. And by caricaturing each other, we deepen our divides. I think if we actually could cross some of those lines, we might find that rural and urban people want to do a lot of the same things. Make their kids successful, find ways to take care of their families, enjoy the great outdoors of this country, much of which is rural. And so I think we just have to find ways to bridge those gaps actively.
Great points. And I agree with you in terms of service. I will tell you from personal experience, as a kid from a small town in Pennsylvania who'd been on an airplane once in his life, never left the country before going to West Point. The experience of the military and the perspective that it provided for me was really unparalleled. In fact, it was as a young West Point cadet in the 1990s, Secretary Rice, where there's no reason you'd ever remember, but you and I met for the first time at Secretary Schultz's house at a reception with that Matt Spence, one of your students at the time when you were provost there. And I mean, for the kid from small town Pennsylvania to suddenly be on Stanford's campus talking to these experts on Russia was eye-opening and such a broadening experience for me, and completely changed my perspective. So Ambassador McFaul, I mean, aside from making sure that your debate partner gets elected to the United States Senate and you become an ambassador, I mean, there's other thoughts on how we can bridge that divide.
Well, I'm just going to amplify a couple of things that Condi said. One, the data on this is very, very striking. And let me advertise another book. I'm going to keep advertising books because that's what I want to do as a political scientist, as a professor. One of our colleagues here at Stanford and Hoover, his name's Jonathan Roden, wrote this fantastic book. It's called Why Cities Lose: The Deep Roots of the Urban-Rural Political Divide. I'll put it in the chat. And it provides the data that Condi said. People think of California as being, all red, all blue, and we're not. It's really the urban-rural divide that is the one that you see the preference is different. Similarly, in Montana, I'm pretty sure President Biden won the city of Missoula, right? And he won Bozeman, but he didn't win the state. And so that is the real cleavage in America, not red states and blue states. And I would just say anything that can bring people in contact with each other. The notion of the other is always dangerous. And the notion of what I would call, as somebody from Montana that is in a lot of foreign policy debates on the coast, this treating the middle of the country as some anthropological study, like Condi said. Let's go see what the natives think. It really drives me nuts, Seth. It is so it makes assumptions about what people think, and it's just wrong. Number one. Number two, I have, again, anecdotal data in addition to Professor Roden's book. When my last book came out, I went to 25 states, I believe, and I went to a lot of states in between the coast on purpose, and was always blown away by number one, 1,300 people showing up in Tulsa, 900 people showing up in Bozeman. I think we had a great crowd in Missoula. I was just in Sioux Falls, South Dakota 2 weeks ago talking about this horrific war in Ukraine. 3,000 people came. 3,000 people came. Now, again, these are the urban areas, right? So we got to remember that. But I think we need to not treat them as the other. We need to treat them as citizens. And I just think, as Condi said, anything that brings people together is useful to our society. As a kid in Montana, I went to Boys State, and you may think, well, it's just a bunch of Montanans. And we're all, cowboys, but the kids from Bozeman and Boys State were a lot different from some of the kids in many rural places in Montana. I learned a ton about my own state just by participating in those kind of configurations that bring us together without, preconceived notions of who we are. So the bigger things that Condi emphasized, I completely agree, but also these smaller things I think are useful as well.
Well, thank you. Great points, and really appreciate both your perspectives on just the value of engagement, spending time with people from different places. And I want to be sensitive to our time. We're going to move to questions in a couple of minutes, but I would be doing a disservice to our community if I didn't spend at least a few minutes before the question period on Ukraine. Obviously, the scenes from Ukraine are horrific. We've seen the nature of this conflict, evolve over the previous few weeks from what we thought would be a very rapid Russian victory to now a prolonged kind of almost war of attrition. We see the Russian strategy shifting a bit right now. So really two questions. What do you believe are Putin's objectives now, and what do you see as the end game here, or the potential kind of end game scenarios given the state of the conflict at this moment? Maybe start on this one with Ambassador McFaul, and then to Secretary Rice.
Well, you should start with Condi, not me. She knows Putin better than I do. First,
I've made her go first both times. So
fair enough. So a couple of thoughts. I mean, first of all, I think the debate, because I see some in the chat about NATO and what does that mean. I think we need to remember that the cause of this war was not NATO expansion, was not us. We are not to blame. This is about Putin's obsession with Ukraine. He doesn't believe it's a country. In fact, I'm going to advertise one more book. This one, it's called Democracy by Condoleezza Rice. And Condi, this was when I first got this book. This is when I first felt this, and I hope Condi will go into the story when she's talking to Putin, and it says here, Ukraine is a made-up country. That's Vladimir Putin, I think, at the Bucharest summit in 2008. And I think that's really important for people to understand that he's been obsessed with trying to bring together the Slavic nation. And that's what this is about. And two, this is about a fight between a dictatorship and a democracy, right? If Ukraine was not a democracy, Putin would not be as obsessed with the place as he is. And I think it's wrong, therefore, to think that this has something to do with NATO and the United States. I mean, that's Putin's propaganda. That's what he wants us to believe. I do not think that's true. Second, I think Putin did overreach. I think he thought this was going to be easy. This is kind of like his Afghanistan, as it was for Brezhnev, where he won some easy wars and then he overstretched here, and that's good news as far as I'm concerned. But three, in terms of my best guess, I do think he's changed. And according to me, he's on Plan D, right? Plan A, shock and awe, didn't work. Zelensky didn't run. The Ukrainians didn't run away. Plan B, to seize all the major cities, that didn't work. Plan C, to bomb them into oblivion, except for Mariupol, that hasn't worked. So now he's on to Plan D, which is to try to connect Crimea in the south to Donbass in the east. And if you look with the focus on that city of Mariupol, we've all been looking at the maps on TV every day. That seems to be his next objective. The Ukrainians' objective is to stop that. And I think we are going to see a very conventional war in that part of the country. And I can't predict how it'll end, but I think it will be the biggest war we've seen in Europe since World War II. What I hope is either the Ukrainians win and or they fight to a stalemate. I think the stalemate is more likely. And then I hope that could create the permissive conditions for a peace settlement. But I don't know that to be true, and I'm interested to hear what Condi thinks.
Yeah. Well, won't surprise you to hear that. I think I completely agree with Mike. And let me just underscore, I dealt with Vladimir Putin for 8 years, not until democracies started in places like Ukraine and Georgia did he become obsessed with NATO expansion. He never mentioned it in the years before because it really wasn't an issue for him. The issue for him is the reestablishment of Greater Russia, and to do so in a way that protects him and Russia from democracy, because he really does worry about contagion of democracy from a place like Ukraine into Russia. And it's awfully important to get inside his mindset to understand that, because I think it makes it very hard to see an end game that would be acceptable to the Ukrainians, let alone the rest of the world, and to Vladimir Putin. And so I think they will eventually get to a stalemate. I don't know that it'll be a way to get to peace, because one thing that Putin has done with his brutality in the East is he's turned Russian-speaking populations against Russia. The way that people have fought in Kharkiv, the way people have fought in Mariupol, these are places with large Russian populations, Russian-speaking populations, and they also want the Russians out because they want Ukrainian democracy. And he underestimated the degree to which Ukraine is a real country, and he underestimated the degree to which the West would respond. And oh, by the way, he overestimated his own armed forces, which have just behaved miserably. I mean, this is it's really quite a show to see how much money they spent on these armed forces and how poorly they performed. I just want to note that if there's to be a peace settlement, I hope we put the Ukrainians in a position that the peace settlement is one that is favorable to Ukraine, not favorable to Russia. And there are 3 reasons for that. The first is, after the butchery that the Russians have visited on Ukraine, to let Putin, quote, have a way out, I think now is morally not acceptable. Can you imagine Vladimir Putin ever again walking into number 10 Downing Street or into the White House? He has assured that Russia is going to be as isolated as it has been since the end of Joseph Stalin's reign, as long as he is president. And so if he wins, we have to live with him for a longer period of time. If he loses, maybe somebody will take care of it within his den of thieves, because those hard men around him, the Patriots of the world, are not sentimental. Secondly, he has to not win because of the fence sitters, particularly the Indians and others, but also China, which has taken a bet on Russia. And I have to think that Xi Jinping, having signed this friendship that would have no limits, suddenly finds himself in the company of a homicidal maniac who is bringing down sanctions and who is destroying Europe. The Chinese like certainty. They like order. This is disorderly. So how this ends will affect their behavior, not just with Russia, but in Asia more broadly. And then the final thing is it was Churchill who encouraged us to meet the Soviet forces as far east as possible, because diplomacy actually is a function of situation on the ground, not the other way around. And if in fact the Russians can succeed in, as Mike put it, Plan D, then that will be a problem for the international community. But I will tell you, even if they sort of succeed in Plan D, in other words, they take the territory, I think they're going to face an insurgency for a long time to come, because the sheer brutality that they've used will make it hard for their People's Republic of Luhansk or their People's Republic of Donetsk to actually govern. They might be able to rule by fear, but it's quite a different thing if you have Ukrainians who will continue to fight. So I don't see an easy end to this. Unfortunately, I think we're going to see a lot more bloodshed and a lot more civilian deaths. And just two things that I would hope we're starting to do. One is we are taking down names for those war crimes, and that's very important. But secondly, the Ukrainians should soon make a claim against Russian frozen assets. Because not a penny of those frozen assets should go back to the oligarchs, back to Moscow, back to Putin. They should be used to rebuild the Ukrainian country, the Ukrainian nation, in a way that might get the Russians' attention.
Well, thank you, Secretary Rice. And one more question, then we'll go to our audience questions. And really, taking the long view of Russia here, right? You have the world's second largest nuclear power, permanent member of the UN Security Council. When we first met in the 90s, we had hopes of Russia being a member of that international community. We're in a state where obviously there's no path probably for Putin to not be an international pariah for the rest of his life. But what is there? How do we think about isolating Putin or Putinism without isolating Russia? And how do you think about that for the United States and the global community moving forward?
Well, that is such an important point because the Russian people deserve better than this too. I will never forget, I studied in the Soviet Union, believe it or not, in 1979. And Soviet citizens looked at their feet. They didn't travel. They accepted whatever green shoes in size 9 central planning spit out that year. And this Russian population, 30 years now since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and actually even further back with the liberalization under Gorbachev, they have become accustomed to traveling. Mike and I have taught them in our classes at Stanford. They were founding young tech companies, entrepreneurs. Two things are happening. They're leaving in droves because they know that this is not the Russia they signed on for. And so there is a brain drain. I hope that we can help them when they come to the West, perhaps to go back under better circumstances. And then finally, whatever little green shoots we can help to stay alive around Navalny, for instance, or around others, we need to try to do that even under the horrors of Putin's Russia, because you're absolutely right. The Russian people had come to expect better. They were doing better. And now they find themselves as isolated as they have been in decades.
Ambassador McFaul, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with Condi. Just add a couple other things. One, during times of war, there's a rallying around the flag effect, and people in Russia, from what we can understand about Russians, are upset about sanctions. They're blaming us. And at the same time, right, that I didn't say, but at the same time, there is a churning of doubt about the objectives, the meaning of this war, even by some, pro-Putin people on TV. That's interesting to me. Number two, I see public opinion polls cited a lot, especially in major newspapers. And I know all those companies well. I've known them for 30 years. I used to contract with them even before I was ambassador. We should be very careful about overreading those public opinion polls. About 60% support the war, or 70%. As one of my Russian colleagues in exile said here at Stanford the other day, a journalist, Roman Bodnar is his name, in exile for the reasons Condi just described. He said, Mike, he said this publicly, so it's okay for me to quote him. He said, these polls are like doing a poll in the gulag. There's no rational incentive to express what you really believe when your phone is being listened to. I mean, think about it, hey, Volodya, I'm calling you here from Moscow. Volodya's out in Novosibirsk. He said, what do you think of Putin? There's only one rational answer to that. So I think we need to be careful about what we think we know. And I would add to that, that what we do know from sociological research is that there is a pretty clear correlation between those that support Putin and those that don't, which is the older you are, the less educated you are, the more rural area you live in, the more likely you are to support Putin. You watch his TV shows and support Putin. But the converse is equally true. The younger you are, the more urban place you live, the more education you have, and I left out the last one, the richer you are, the four of those, the more likely you don't watch Putin's propaganda and you get your media from other sources. There's a reason that Putin arrested Navalny right before this war. We didn't know it at the time, now we know it. There's a reason he closed down Echo Moskvy, the leading independent radio station, and TV Dozh, TV Rain, the leading independent television station. There's a reason he closed down Facebook and both Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, because those are all the sources where that second demographic gets their media, that gets their information, right? And by the way, if they were doing well in the war, he wouldn't be shutting these folks down. So I don't know when it is, but I think we should do, as Condi said, help to nurture those sprouts that might be left or will sprout again inside Russia. And then to those that are forced into exile, give them support for the time that they'll be in exile so that there'll be a moment when they can eventually return. I don't know when it is, but I kind of think that this, like I said, Putin overreached. I think it'll be very hard. He'll probably be in power for as long as he's able. I think it'll be very hard for him to designate a Putin 2.0 and say, you know, let's do more of this for the next 20 years. I think that's going to be a hard argument. I don't want to predict how I know it'll end, but I'm actually more optimistic today about how the Putin regime might wind down faster than I was even before the war.
Well, thank you both. I want to turn to audience questions now, and we have our first question from a member of our live studio audience, actually a student here at Big Sky High School in Missoula, Montana, Annalise Migliaccio. Annalise, go ahead.
Hi, yes. Thank you. Hi, yes, my name is Annalise Migliaccio, and I'm a senior at Big Sky High School in Missoula. And this is kind of going back to the theme of the urban and rural divide. So as a student that attended rural school in grades K through 8, I then transitioned to an urban, by Montana standards, high school. I witnessed the differences in values and opinions that stemmed from rural and urban settings. These differences in values seem to impact how people engage in politics. How do you feel democracy can take into account such diverse perspectives and continue to function while also fostering an understanding of others' perspectives and values?
Over to you, Condi.
Okay, right. Well, the first thing I'll say is that to learn to value both sets of values, if you will. I think that one thing that happens is that there's a tendency to say, well, rural values are superior, urban values are superior. What's made America great is that we've actually been a blending of a variety of experiences, a variety of takes on what constitutes success. You can live rural and not have to deal with urban traffic, and you can live on a farm and enjoy the wonderfulness of the outdoors, or perhaps you like the city and you like the bustle of the city. But what we tend to do when we talk about the divide is to seem to suggest that one is superior to the other. I just want to again say the United States has done very well with the blending, but with the blending also comes respect. And here I actually think it's more on urban than on rural. To understand the values that you suggested, to understand that people may still choose to have a certain set of family values. It's a little bit tricky because, you know, again, I grew up in segregated Birmingham, and at one point, people were making values arguments to defend segregation, and we don't want to make values arguments to defend discrimination of any kind. But we also want to recognize that there can be different takes on a political issue or on a social issue, and to respect that. I think you're a very good example of somebody who's bridging that divide just by your presence there in Missoula, and I hope there will be more of you.
And I just agree. I just think the key word there that Condi said is respect. I don't have to agree with you if you have different values than me or different policy issues, domestic or foreign policy. But as long as we agree to the basic rules of the game of democracy, then we should resolve our differences on policy issues through the democratic process. We can't undermine the democratic institutions to do that. That's the baseline. And again, in my own historical experience, I was born in Glasgow, Montana, just so everybody knows. People from Bozeman think I'm from Bozeman. I only spent 2 years in Bozeman. I also spent a lot of time in Butte. And the difference between Butte and Bozeman and Glasgow is a lot bigger than the difference between a lot of places here in California. And I would just say respect. You don't have to agree, but you have to listen and appreciate that somebody might have a different point of view, and it has to go both ways. With this baseline, you don't get to break the system if you don't like the outcome. And that has happened historically around the world. And there's some in this country that want to do it here. And that has to be an absolute no-no. That, the rules of the game have to be set, the democratic rules, and then how we litigate the differences of public policy opinions within that. I think we have to respectfully disagree. And then, one other thing we have to do, when we lose the debate, we don't blame those that we lost it to. We think about better arguments for convincing them in the future. This is something in the Democratic Party that used to drive me nuts. Whenever we would lose an election on the presidential level, and we did many, many times, and I worked on some of those campaigns, we'd always blame the voters. It was finally Senator Obama said, we're not doing that. We're going to win the voters. And I think and I think of this as a teacher, by the way. When my students are not understanding what I'm trying to teach, that they're not getting the argument, that's my fault. That's not their fault. And I think that attitude, if people are not agreeing with you, then you've got to try harder to make the argument rather than say, dismiss them and their ideas.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Annalise. Now we're actually going to go to one of our Zoom participants, Keaton Sunchild. Keaton is joining us from Billings, Montana, and he is the political director of Western Native Voice. Go ahead, Keaton.
Thank you, President Bodnar, and thank you, Secretary and Ambassador, for your time today. Like was just mentioned, I'm the political director for Western Native Voice. We are a nonprofit in Montana that specializes in voting rights and human rights for Native Americans in Montana. And I am currently in Eugene, Oregon, going to law school, but our organization is based in Billings, and we have over 12,000 members in Montana, and then a couple thousand spread out over Idaho, the Dakotas, Washington, and then here in Oregon as well. But my question to you guys is, we work with a lot of folks who feel like their voice doesn't matter, whether that's in an election or just in their community in general, in society. So just wondering some examples you guys have seen in the US or other parts of the world that demonstrate to minority groups like Native Americans that their voice does in fact matter, and how we can kind of relay that message here at home.
Yep, Secretary Rice.
Yeah, go ahead, Condi.
All right, great. Well, first of all, I think you have to impress upon people that their voice most certainly will not matter if they don't use it and if they don't exercise it. I've often heard, well, I'm not sure, my voice doesn't matter, and so I won't vote or I won't organize. And that's not the answer. And particularly when you are in the minority, you have to exercise your voice in several different ways. The first is, obviously, you have to make known the plight of and circumstances of being a minority. Secondly, you have to find allies who will help you in that struggle. And third, you have to be willing to go to the ramparts and get out there and canvass and get people to vote and make democracy isn't easy. And it can't be delivered on a silver platter. It takes really hard work. I will give you an example. I'm from Birmingham, and the current mayor of Birmingham is 38 years old. He's a Black person, Black man, and he knocked on 50,000 doors to get himself elected. 50,000 doors. And so I would say you have to work really, really hard, and you have to get the circumstances and the plight known. And just abandoning the playing field is not going to get it done. Now, you're not going to win every struggle. But I come from a particular minority that did win that struggle. The struggle goes on, but I can tell you that I couldn't go to a movie theater or to a restaurant when I was a little kid. And I eventually became Secretary of State. And so I think America wants to be a place where all voices are heard. I think America wants to be a place where minorities are not discriminated against and where they have their due. But it's incumbent on us too, as minorities, to reach across and make it happen. We can't just sit back and say, we expect you to make it happen for us. And that's why I'm so glad that you mentioned the nonprofit that you're working for and with. Civil society is the bedrock of democracy. Mike and I went across the world talking to countries that wanted to make a democratic transition about the fact that it's not just about your government. It's not just about voting. It's not just about your institutions. It's also about civil society and citizens' action. And so congratulations to you for what you're doing.
I would just agree, Keaton, with the added thing about organization is key. It sounds like you already have a giant organization, so congratulations on that. Technology helps with that, I think. There's a lot of criticism of the companies where Condi and I live, and I think rightly so. They should be scrutinized in a democratic way. But I don't think we should remember the positive roles that they can play too. Most certainly in Russia today and Ukraine, without YouTube, there is no democratic opposition inside Russia. Sounds like you're already doing that. And the third thing I would say, just having studied civil society as an academic, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in terms of American politics, iterating things that people can do and giving them voice has demonstrated as a way to keep them alive. Asking people just to mobilize for elections, the social science on that shows that people don't like that. They get tired of that. And so and I'm sure you're already doing this, but I would just underscore that's an important piece too, that there are things that people can do between elections, and then they'll be more likely to mobilize for elections. And by the way, I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, we had a lot of mobilization in the last election. I thought it was pretty awesome myself. That was a sign of the renewal that Condi was talking about 30 minutes ago or whenever it was. That was a really impressive moment in terms of our democracies. And that meant people like you, Keaton, were probably helping to get the vote out. That was a positive sign for me.
Thank you. Great question, Keaton. Thank you for joining us. We're now going to come back to our live audience here, and we have Cameron Vaughn. Cameron, are you here? Cameron is a graduate and a recent recipient of the Fulbright. So, Cameron.
Hi, thank you both for your time today. I'm Cameron Vaughn. I'm from Lewistown in rural central Montana and had the privilege of studying Russian and political science here at And as President Bodnar said, I'll be going to the Republic of Georgia in the fall on a Fulbright scholarship. So moving forward, how effective can values-based US foreign policy be in advocating for democratic principles in post-Soviet states where Putin's influence will likely result in trends towards autocracy?
Mike, why don't you start?
Okay. First of all, congratulations, Cameron. I was a Fulbright scholar at Moscow State University too, a zillion years ago. And before you go, email me, because we have lots of colleagues in Georgia. We work with them through various training programs here at Stanford, and we'll make sure you get to meet them. It's a fantastic place, fantastic country, vibrant civil society, but in a tough time right now. So I think it's a very interesting time to be there. And for those of you who don't know, some of the best food in the world. I'm a huge fan of Georgian food. When I was ambassador and our family, we ever had a holiday, we went to two places, Uzbek restaurants and Georgian restaurants. So no matter what, you're going to have a fantastic time there. I don't have a great answer to your question other than to say, of course, 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I would have hoped that there would have been more consolidated democracies in the region, including Georgia, by the way, and that we need to understand the causes of that. I think having a giant autocracy next to you and Vladimir Putin is a central reason, and most certainly in Georgia is the central reason, I think, for why they have had a hard time consolidating democratic institutions. But I would just say, a couple of things, and I've heard Condi say this about our own country in other talks. Democracy is a long process. It took us a long time, and we're still working at it. So we shouldn't expect things to just happen overnight. There was a lot of historical negative legacies in the Soviet, in the states that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet system that are still lingering, that have to be overcome. And at the same time, when I look at those demographics that I talked about for Russia, they're the same in Georgia. They're actually the same throughout the region. That gives me hope that your generation might, Georgians of your generations, Moldovans of your generations, Ukrainians of your generations might to help get it right. And the other thing I would say is something that a friend of mine used to say. He was assassinated in 2015. His name is Boris Nemtsov. He used to always say, as things were going badly in Russia, he said, Mike, the West needs to make big bets on democratic breakthroughs. And he always would mention two countries, Georgia and Ukraine, because in Boris's mind, he said, if they succeeded, that demonstration effect would help to inspire those in Russia, those in Belarus, those in Armenia. And I think about that a lot right now, of course, with respect to Ukraine. That's why I think the stakes are so high in Ukraine, because if Ukraine fails, that empowers Vladimir Putin, and that scares our allies, and I think it empowers autocrats all over the world. Whereas if Ukraine prevails and succeeds in pushing back the invaders, that will inspire small d Democrats throughout the region, and I think throughout the world. And by the way, I think that'll make autocrats around the world think twice about doing this horrific thing that Putin has done to Ukraine. So I think, in fact, what happens in Ukraine will have a direct impact about the future of democracy in places like Georgia.
Yeah, I would just very quickly, congratulations. It's going to be great. Just two very quick things. The first is, yes, Georgian democracy is very challenged right now, but there is a civil society that is fighting back about it and a press that fights back about it. And so that's a very good sign. And as to Ukraine, it's interesting because if you'd asked me 10 years ago, was Ukraine going to be carrying the banner for democracy in the former Soviet states, I wouldn't have bet on it necessarily. We worried 10, 15 years ago about corruption in Ukraine. There seemed to be a sort of carousel of one after another leaders who just engaged in infighting among themselves, didn't seem to do much for the country. But ironically, after Crimea, Ukraine began to get its act together domestically. And I don't think that, countries do this by kind of leaps and bounds sometimes. And the emergence of Zelensky as a not just democratically elected leader, but one who really clearly has the core interest of his nation and of his people at heart, it could mean a real leap forward if the Ukrainians win this, that others will look and say, why not us?
Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. And now one more final question before we wrap up. We have another participant on Zoom. I'm going to ask Rich Roth to join us. Rich is the president of IX Ranch Company from Big Sandy. Rich.
Hi, everybody. We're talking about democracy and all these things, and maybe a few more of these over there in DC might help out. A few more of these cowboy hats. We're pretty easygoing folks up here, but it is kind of cool to hear, Ambassador McFaul from Glasgow, Montana. I was just over there the other day. It wasn't super nice over there, but it's been a little bit rough in our country these past few months. And this is a great topic. I really appreciate, President Bodnar, for inviting me or having me here today, and Madam Secretary, Mr. Ambassador. In the ranching world where we are here, my family, I'm a third generation rancher up here in Montana. We're a commodity. We're a cow-calf operation. We run about 3,500 mother cows on about 130,000 acres up here in God's country. And it is a commodity. And so our product has to be going around the world. We need mouths to feed. And so even though these world issues, we're not oblivious to them, sometimes we're a little bit more caught up on saving calves and dealing with drought and those things. But I do think one of the interesting things is we've been following this whole thing with Ukraine and just the world in general, and it's been brought up all throughout this, is that, this instability, in the recent months and these supply chain, disruptions over the past few years. And, they've really underscored the importance of building a stronger, economic relationships with, trustworthy markets, like who are we doing business with? We've got higher input costs and this whole scarcity of supplies and other market pressures that make it really, difficult for industries like ours to remain competitive and sustainable. And so it also kind of brings in this whole kind of world security and goods and services being traded around. And we all need world trade partners. I mean, the United States is a fantastically well-built country. We have a lot of things, but we do need trade. I mean, I'm a huge supporter of that. But I guess my question would ultimately be is, how can our trade policies, how can effective trade policies address these current and future, global economic instabilities? And then as kind of a second part of that question, how should we be kind of prioritizing our trade with our allies in terms of like, who are we doing business with? Are we doing business with those that we kind of align and have the same thoughts on, or are we just doing trade and working with other countries just because we have to? I think that's certainly a big concern of ours in the ag world, and because we have grain and beef and all kinds of wonderfully great commodities produced in this country, and we need outlets for them, but we also need to be doing it in a responsible fashion.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a really excellent point. And I do think that the world of trade is going to undergo a fairly dramatic change and transformation. I think for me, as Secretary of State, I thought of markets should be open to all American product, and all markets should be open to all American product. Speaking of Putin, one of the longest discussions I actually had with Putin was why he ought to lift their ban on American pork, because he kept saying that it caused trichinosis. And I remember having this conversation thinking, I can't believe I'm talking to the Russian president about pork. But as Secretary of State, I promoted this notion that American product ought to go everywhere and at all times. I think what we're going to start to see is that the kind of globalized trading environment that we have fostered, that I still believe in, is going to start to change in two very important ways. I think you're going to see more regional trade activities, more regional trade agreements, kind of like we have with the US, Mexico, Canada, where you unite the North American platform, Latin America. We've tried from time to time to have free trade agreements with Latin America because that's a natural for us. I think you will see less of the kind of World Trade Organization activity that we've become accustomed to, and more of what you just leaned toward, which is what we call trusted partners or reliable partners. And we have a lot of them. The good news is the United States, more than any country in the world, has a lot of reliable partners. Places like Japan and Korea and Australia and the like. And now the problem is some of our reliable partners also have very closed trading systems. So I also spent a lot of my time trying to get American beef into Korea and into Japan. So we're going to need to have more of an understanding of where some of those reliable partners are and see if we can encourage them to have more open markets for trade so that we're not so dependent on countries that then become unreliable. Russia is going to be out of the trading system now, I think, for some time to come, where we where we're concerned. But again, we have a lot of reliable partners. Not all of them are committed to free trade. This is going to require a lot of hard work, but it adds yet another dimension to what our trade representatives are going to have to deal with. You know, you're in the agricultural business. I think we're all concerned about what is going to happen to food supply with Russia and Ukraine out of the food supply business. Some 30% of wheat is Russian, another 9–10% Ukrainian. Huge amounts of fertilizer, potash, and things that are important for fertilizer come out of Russia. And so you're going to see a significant, I think, redistribution and rejiggering of trade relationships. And you're right to point us toward having a strategy for that as the United States that allows us to make better use of regional partners, that allows us to make better use of trusted partners, but that recognizes that some of our trusted partners are pretty closed economies.
And Rich, just really quick, I know we're over time. First of all, my mom's from Chinook, Montana, so not too far away, just so you know, and I think she might be on this call. So she'll be glad I gave a shout out to Chinook, not too far from Big Sandy. I just agree. Two things. In fact, I was just talking to a farmer in Ukraine 3 days ago. By the way, Rich, he has a little bit of a different problem than you have. I hope you don't have this problem. His farm is to the north of Kiev. He has a big farm up there, and right now they're clearing artillery and various shrapnel, various rocket shells. But the resilience of his country. He said before, when the war started, Mike, we thought we were going to get back to 80% no matter what, but now we're gearing towards 100%, precisely because of what Condi mentioned. They need to bring the things that they grow back online for the global economy and for the Ukrainian economy. And one thing he said to me at the end of our call, it's another way of saying what Condi said. He said, Mike, we have got to have better, closer trade relations between democracies. And we were talking mostly about energy and potash, actually, Condi. By the way, I also talked about ractopamine with the Russians in pork and why it doesn't kill people, his point was stable supply of energy, will help us all in terms of what we do in the future. And he was talking about democracies of the world need to be more closely aligned. And to Condi's point, not all democracies are as open, in my view, as they should be. But building those ties, I think will make the democratic world a lot better off, and especially in the energy world. We need more energy in the system right now, in my view, and let's make that more energy from democratic suppliers. I think that will make us all better off, and most certainly we'll be more secure in that. And I just think that's a world which we should all strive to live in. It is not a spurious correlation that when communist countries fell and democracies took over, global trade grew. Right. And I think that the relationship between democracy, the subject of our conversation today, and markets is a positive one. And so let's remember that those things can be, synergistic in the way that they interact, including for farmers in Montana and farmers in Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Rich. Thanks for a great question. And we are sadly at time. So I do want to be respectful of Secretary Rice's time, Ambassador McFaul's time, and close by saying thank you. You know, I wish we had 3 more hours. I wish we had you here on campus. Hopefully that will happen. But what a great dialogue. You know, we talked about the importance of bridging divides, of cooperation. We talked about the importance of giving that exposure to the next generation. I think there's so much opportunity for collaboration. You know, perhaps even a joint gap year program between the Hoover Institution and the Mansfield Center, talking about the rural-urban divide. I think there's some things we can work on together. But I want to thank you so much for being here. We do have a small gift. You know, we pulling off these hybrid lectures is always hard. So normally we'd have you come up, but I'm going to hold this on camera. You know, at major events at the University of Montana, we always take a moment to acknowledge that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people, many of whom are our colleagues, our friends, our students, and we celebrate and honor the rich and important role that American Indian heritage and culture have played, not just in this university's past, but our present and in our future. And in recognition of that, our gift today is a beautiful pen and some nice a necklace that was done by Salish artisans, and we will send this to you as a gift of thanks for your time here today. And I want to thank our audience. I want to thank our Mansfield Center team, our University Center team, our IT team, of course, Denise, for being a part of this. It's not easy to put on these types of events, but Secretary Rice, Ambassador McFaul, it has been an honor to welcome you for an hour to the University of Montana family. Thank you for enriching us with your perspective, your wisdom. We are deeply grateful, and we are excited to have you both here in beautiful Missoula, Montana, hopefully very soon. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Y'all,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.